Hey guys, I've had a few people ask me to do a tutorial on finishing. This is a Death Trooper helmet that I've been working on, and as you'll see, it's got some kind of interesting finishes and people wanted to know about this. This is actually unfinished at this point, but what it is it's very smooth. We've got a very smooth surface here that eventually will end up being painted. One of the things about 3D printing is when you 3D print, as you can see the sheen on this one, this is an unfinished piece and we're going to add this to the helmet. You get these little ridges from the printing is how it does. Well, I mean, that's okay for common everyday little printed pieces that you're using, but when you're trying to make a replica part, in this case like this helmet, you don't want that in there. You want a nice smooth part. It needs to look finished. So I've developed some techniques. I've read a lot of stuff on the internet. I've gotten some stuff from other people, and then I've kind of been working with it and perfected some of those techniques on my own that I've kind of, I guess, made my own techniques off of that. The biggest thing to start with is acetone. The really nice part, I work entirely with ABS. I don't like PLA. We live down here in Florida. So the problem is with PLA is it's got too low of a melting temperature. So if I take these parts out of my car and I leave them in the car, I come back and they're all warped and partially melted. So I work with ABS. And as I said, the nice part about ABS is that it actually dissolves in acetone. So you can use acetone to make a chemical weld. And that's really awesome. It's better than glue, because when you glue something, you basically have a glue and you're looking for some kind of chemical bond between them. But with the acetone, it actually literally melts. It'll melt along one surface and melt along the other surface, and they will adhere. They will actually, you'll end up with a chemical weld, not a glue, a chemical weld between the two pieces. This is another little thing that is extremely important. Is get yourself a little bottle. This is a Starbucks coffee bottle that I got, which is nice. You want glass. You don't want plastic. You want glass bottle. What I've done is, if you look inside there, I have taken a whole bunch of these little scrap pieces. You end up with lots of this little scrap when you're working with 3D printing. I filled it partially full with acetone, and then I melted as much plastic as I could into it. So what I've got is this like paste that is made of acetone that also, made of ABS plastic that's been dissolved in acetone. This will become really important because this is something I can use to fill in areas. You want to make sure you have a good top on it, because when you're not using it, you want to make sure it's sealed. Acetone acetone evaporates very easily, so you need to keep it sealed. The other thing is you need to be in a very well ventilated area. Here in my garage, I've got vents that go out, and what I'm going to do here in a moment is I'm going to turn on a fan before I begin working. I want to have air blowing around me, because blowing the fumes away from me, because I do not want to breathe this stuff. It's really nasty, and it can cause you all kinds of problems. So let's go ahead and let's look at it. Just go over some of the tools that I've got here. You want to get some of these cheap brushes because you're going to destroy them. As they get the acetone and the ABS plastic in it, it actually hardens in there. Kind of the cool part about it, though, is once it does harden, you can kind of flake a lot of it off because it is plastic. The other thing that's important is you want to make sure you get natural fiber brushes, because if you've got brushes that are made out of something that will dissolve with acetone, you're going to end up with just a big stick with goo on the end of it. Guys, these are some good brushes to get. You can buy them usually in packs. I think I got these at Harbor Freight. But the nice thing about them is they've got metal handles, and they're actual real hair for the brushes. So they're not going to melt on you and turn into big globs of plastic on the end of a stick. So the other thing we've got here is a Dremel tool. I use the sanding drum, and I also have the little cutoff discs. So we're going to need those for basically finishing and bringing out some of the details. And let's begin getting this thing together. Okay, I get myself a little jar. Again, you want to make sure that it's glass. This one's got a lot of paint and stuff in it too. But in here, I basically am pouring a little bit of my acetone, not that much, but just enough to cover the bottom. Then what we begin doing, let's begin putting and mounting this piece is going to go right here. So we'll show you how we begin attaching stuff. Okay, the first thing you want to do, I'm going to clean my desk off here with some of the tools, so I've got a little bit more space to work. You do want to make sure that you've got that your acetone is in a spot where you can get to, but also more importantly, that it's not a place where you're going to knock it over as you're moving stuff around, because you're going to, if you knock it over, you start melting parts. Some other things that I've got in here is I've got a few clamps, and if they have the rubber tips on them, I like the metal ones, and take the rubber tips off because the rubber tips can possibly melt with the acetone. So what we're going to do here is we're first going to take a look and make sure that our part fits. If there's anything that needs to be sanded off, we're going to do that. Now in this case, because this is the last piece and all this has been cut in lots of pieces, you'll see this goes in here, but it's not matching up over here perfectly. It comes close, but not quite. So once we get over there, what we're going to actually have to do is, that's been caused by warping. In other words, as these large pieces have been printed on the printer, you get some warping that occurs. So what I'm going to have to do is, once we get over here, is we're going to have to heat that plastic up and then move it into position before we can glue the last piece on. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start by gluing just this edge here. This is actually probably one of the toughest pieces to glue in this whole helmet. The other ones were much easier because I didn't have to match up so many edges. What I'm going to do is basically put a little bit of acetone right there on that edge, and we're going to let that sit for just a few seconds while I come over here and do the same thing over here. And while that's setting, that acetone is going to just soften the plastic up just a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do this edge, and we're going to do that last edge after they've all been glued. Actually, in this case, I'm going to leave that one unglued because we want to be able to separate the two halves, but I am going to want to make sure we get it matched up. So now that I've got that in there, I can already see if I touch that, it's starting to get kind of sticky. I'm going to put one more dose on there. The stuff actually evaporates rather rapidly. And then we're going to match it up. And you want to match up your biggest details. If there's gaps, don't worry about it, because we can fill those gaps in, but the details are hard to fill in. So as you can see, I've got this. I want to make sure we've got a good right up here along this detail, and that this detail along here remains flat, because those are going to be harder to be able to sand out later on. This along here, I'm not worried about too much. Again, because of the expansion of the material, this along here, we've actually got a pretty good little crack there, and I'll show you how we fill that in here in a moment. But what we're going to do is I'm going to add just a little bit more into that crack, and we're going to make sure we've got some in there. Now this is going to dry pretty fast. It doesn't last that long before it evaporates off, and when it evaporates off, then we got a nice chemical connection. Now what I'm also going to do is, if you look in here along the edge of this piece, there was some areas where we had a little bit of separation occurred, where as the two pieces of plastic were laid down and it began heating, they began basically, the warping caused them to peel up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take some of the acetone and I'm going to basically just brush this whole piece. Now, what this is going to do is it's actually going into the cracks. I want to apply this pretty liberally. I want to put a nice sheen on there. And the thing is, you want to do this partially because what this is going to do is it's going to fill in a lot of those little micro cracks that have occurred between the print layers. It's going to melt the plastic and then it's going to fuse back together. And it actually ends up making it stronger. Now, the thing is you don't want to put too much. You don't want to take and soak this stuff, because then you actually get too much acetone in there and you start melting your piece. But by being here in a nice airy environment, this acetone is actually going to come off pretty quickly. Now, one of the things I've also found is by brushing across the print lines, that also helps eliminate some of the area as well and make it a little bit smoother. And it's already starting to solidify on me. They're pretty good. And once that gets in there good, then we can actually go in and start filling some of this stuff in. But I want to make sure that we've got a spot. Now, one of the things is, if you can see right here, you can see one of those cracks that I was talking about between the pieces. You can see right there. We're going to fill that in here in a moment. You can kind of watch this stuff and you'll see it'll kind of get a little bit of a grayish sheen over it as it's actually dried. Okay, this has begun pretty much drying, or along in here it's dried pretty good. So I'm now going to move on to adding in and filling in the cracks. So I'm going to get my ABS slurry here. And one of the things I want to do is I want to dip my brush into my acetone. And you can see the consistency of this. It's like a very watery paste. And I'm just going to brush that in. We don't want to put too much. You're better off building up some different layers. But the thing is I brush, what I'm really trying to do here is I'm trying to fill in. I've got this crack along here and I'm trying to fill it in. So what I'm trying to do mostly here is brush it, fill in. You want to watch, like I've got a detail area here, you want to try to keep that out of that detail, because it's much easier to be able to sand this stuff off in the flat areas. And that's the other thing, is when you're slicing up your model, you want to make your slices so that your slices occur in areas that are easy to sand, because we want to come back through here and sand this off. And if you've got areas where there's details like this right in here, it's going to become much, much harder to do that. Now I'm just going to brush this in. And then I'm going to get a little bit more acetone on here, and I'm going to come back in these areas in here, I'm going to kind of spread that out. Again, what this ends up doing is this will help me with my sanding later on. I'm not really worried about getting a finished surface at this point, but what I do want to do is I want to make sure that I've got enough material in here that I can sand it once we're done. Now, see, I come from kind of the automotive world and doing automotive work, so this is stuff is kind of akin to Bondo, is the way that we're working on it. This was that little crack that I showed you a moment ago. Again, I'm just putting a little bit of my slurry on that, and I can build that area up. What I want to do is build this up along here enough, again, that I've got material that I can sand away to get that nice smooth surface. Now when this stuff dries, it will literally be hard plastic, which is actually something really, really cool about ABS and working with it this way. Because, like again, I said, it's not glue. This is not Bondo. This is actually melted ABS plastic. So once it dries out, we'll be able to come back in here and sand this area off. I'm putting quite a bit along this crack because, again, I want to be able to sand it out and make it very smooth between these two halves. I've actually got a rough area along the bottom here where the raft didn't come off quite the way I wanted it to. So I'm going to put some more of my slurry in there to fill in between there. If it's not filling in good, add a little bit of acetone and that will kind of thin it out. And we get that to fill in. Now see, once we sand this and then when we paint it, this will end up being gloss smooth. And I'll show you how we get that in probably another video. Again, I'm just taking the slurry here and just filling it in. I actually had a crack right there between these two pieces, and we're going to fill that in. And I want to get enough material on there that I've got something to sand away. Now a lot of these techniques and things that I've developed here kind of really come, like I said, from the automotive world and working with fiberglass and Bondo and doing body modifications to my car. Main thing is I don't want to try to fill this all in good so we don't have any holes. Now again, you got to work fast with this stuff because if you see, it's already beginning to dry, which I actually like because I'm kind of one of those guys that likes instant gratification, so I don't like waiting around overnight for things to dry. So this to me is actually much better than the fiberglass I used to work with automotive parts, because literally within probably about 20 minutes this will be pretty much completely dry. Now I will tell you, it'll be dry on the outside, but it may not be dry on the inside. You have to let all of the acetone essentially evaporate off and for it to completely dry before you really begin sanding. Otherwise, you will have problems. Because what you'll find is that it's hard on the outside and it's soft in the middle. The other thing is you do not want to add heat to this. You want to let it just dry off at room temperature. I found that when you add heat, what happens is the acetone will actually bubble off and it will create bubbles in your plastic. Where if you just let it do its thing naturally, it seems to come out. Now, I haven't tried actually pouring this into larger molds to see how that works, but I'm guessing that you probably would end up with some bubbling that ends up occurring because of it. Again, I'm going to come back in here and just get my details. If you do get some of this slurry on there, you can actually use your little bit of acetone and brush it off. You want to be careful of where the stuff pools because you don't want it to pool too much. Like back in there, I've got a little pool, so I'm going to get that out so that we let it flash off. Now, the kind of thing that's kind of cool is that you can actually, depending upon looking at the surface of depending upon the surface that you're looking for, I've found that by using this technique of just brushing this on, you can actually end up with a nice shiny surface that looks pretty good if you're just going plastic and you're not even going to be painting them. The acetone, again, like it just melts the surface and then it evaporates off. There's been a lot of different techniques that I found just brushing it on. Now, if you get really tiny fine details, I mean like really little small details, this will melt those, so you kind of want to be careful of that. But for larger pieces, such as this helmet, you'll never see that. It's much too large. So let me go ahead and we're going to let this dry, and we'll come back and I'll show you how we sand it out and what kind of finishes we can get on it. Okay guys, I let this dry for about 12 hours, which it's now very hard. All that plastic, this ABS slurry that we put on there is now rock hard. It's basically plastic at this point. So the next step is to sand this down and get it nice and smooth. Now I'm going to just use a little sander like this. This is good for using on the flat surfaces. You have to be careful though. When I printed this project, I printed it with a pretty strong wall. If you printed your pieces with a very thin wall, you can go through them pretty rapidly, so you got to be careful. I usually try to use at least 5 or 6 layers of solid material on the outside of my projects so that I've got something to sand off of. I'm actually starting with some 40. And what we're going to do is take down the big high surfaces, and then we'll switch to 80, and then finally to 120. So let's take off some of the surface. What I'm working on here is the areas where we put this on. One of the things that's important when you are sanding is keep the sander moving, because you don't want to burn the plastic. You want to let the sandpaper do its stuff and actually sand off. If you keep it in one spot too long, what will happen is it'll just build up friction and you'll start melting the plastic. What we're looking for is, you can see this area right in here. You can see the lines that are in there. What I want to do is get that back to where we don't see any of the lines, so we've got a nice clean surface. Again, you can see here we're taking off a lot of that, and we're now getting a nice smooth surface right across there. By the time we go down to 120 and then to 240 and then we hit it with some paint, that'll be smooth as glass. Now, one of the things you can see where I sanded off here, because I was using a white slurry on a black plastic, you can actually see where the white has actually filled in those cracks. Now, if I steal this, by the way, a lot of times using your hands is better than your eyes, because your fingers tips particularly can feel the rough surface. So when you feel it, as you feel across there, if you feel something, close your eyes. You still got a little bit more sanding to do. Again, you got to be careful with this stuff though, that you don't go all the way through, because you go all the way through and you basically ruined your part. A lot of times you can go back with slurry again and fix it, but you don't want to do that. Let's do it right the first time. One of the things to realize is that you may not get it perfect in this first sanding. You may have to go back in and put some more slurry. If you'll notice along the spots here, I've still got some low spots, and I've taken that down about as much as I want to because I want to keep this smooth here. Also along the back here, there's a little spot where I've got some low spots in there, and those usually show up because, see, they remain shiny. You can kind of see it there. Those remain shiny where I've sanded off the other parts. So I'm probably going to have to come back in and put some more slurry in here so that I can get this nice and smooth. One of the things that I like about using a sander like this is that I basically got a flat surface. So as I'm moving over the top of this, I'm cutting off just the high points. I'm not cutting in. Because you don't really want to cut in, because then you end up, particularly once you get it where it's nice and shiny, you're going to notice these indentations in there. This is something that we did in the automotive industry. You never ever sand a car using just flat sandpaper in your hands. You always use some kind of a block. In fact, they call it blocking. So when you're sanding this stuff, you always want to have some kind of a block, unless you're getting into the details. And you're getting into tiny details, that's one thing. But when you've got a big surface like this, you're trying to make nice and smooth, you want to use a flat surface, or if you're not using a sander like this, you have a block that you use. In fact, I'll probably go back through and hand sand this once we get down to the 240. Okay, what I'm going to do here is, as you can see, I've used a little bit of the slurry to fill in this area right in here, but I want to bring some of the detail back. So I'm going to use a Dremel tool with a sharp little cutting tool on the end of it to kind of come back here and bring some of that detail back in. Now, one of the things is, when working with ABS plastic, you don't want to put too much speed in here, because you'll actually end up melting the plastic versus cutting it. Now, if you're wondering what this black is, the black was some ABS black slurry that I was using earlier, and over the top of the white plastic. You know, because I'm painting these, I don't really necessarily care about what the plastic is, the color of the plastic is that I'm using. In this case, I have white plastic and I got black plastic, and I've just kind of used them interchangeably because eventually this is all going to get painted anyway. So now we've gone, you can see with this side versus this side, I basically brought some detail back, so it looks like we've got actually some kind of connection there going in, and I'm going to do the same thing now for this side. Guys, I can't stress enough here with safety when working with this acetone. There's two things that are really, really important. Number one, you want to be in a very ventilated area. Notice I got the garage door open. I also have a fan right here that's blowing air kind of around my head and away from me. because I don't want that fumes, me breathing in that fumes. The other thing is that this stuff is really, really flammable. So no smoking, and don't use any kind of power tools or anything that's going to spark whatsoever while you've got this stuff open and you're working with it. I don't want to hear about anybody having problems with acetone saying, hey, he told me about it. Guys, it's important. I've also got on goggles. If this stuff splashes in your eyes, it's not good. Work safe. You know, a lot of people are scared of chemicals, particularly things like acetone. It's not a matter of being scared of them. It's a matter of knowing how to use them. Now, in an ideal environment, and if I was using lots and lots of this stuff on an everyday basis, I would actually get myself a ventilation chamber of some sort that I could be working with this. But you know, I've been working around paints and stuff most of my life, and this tends to work pretty good. Again, you can also wear a mask if you find that it's something that you're not able to get enough ventilation. But for me, well, I also live in Florida, so it's very rare that I can't open up the doors and get fresh air coming in here. Anyway, be safe, have a lot of fun with this stuff, and watch my other videos. Okay guys, we've got it all sanded out. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit it with a light coat of primer, and what I'm primarily looking for here is all of these like discolorations and stuff will kind of go away when I put the primer on, and the primer is going to show me areas that I still got problems with. What we'll do is we'll then sand off, and you'll see the low areas where the primer gets left. So that's the primary purpose of this. This isn't really to paint it. So I'm just putting a light coat all over it. Now this is a primer that's made that will work with plastic, which is really important. Already I can see I've got some areas in here where I've still got some little holes, some things that are going to have to be worked out. But overall, we look pretty darn good. Again, I don't want to put a heavy coat on this because I'm not trying to paint and hide things. I actually want to see things. I want to see where I've got imperfections still in my piece. That's the real goal here, is to find the imperfections, because now that I've put a little bit of primer on it, I can start seeing some of the areas where I've still got some issues, where when it's the plastic and it's got the discolorations and everything else in it, you don't see those. Now I can go back in and start fixing some of those little tiny areas. So it's like if I look in here, I can see I've got some details in there that have kind of gotten lost. Those have got to be picked up. I've got a couple spots up in here that have got to be dealt with, some little tiny holes. There's still some sanding that needs to be done in this area right in here. I've got a few little nicks in here that I want to try to fix up. Again, we're looking for those imperfections because the idea is to get a thing. I got an area right there which needs to be fixed a little bit. Same thing in there. And up in here, you can kind of see, I can still see some of my print lines. I don't want to see any of those print lines. So now that we've got it with a light dusting of primer, I'm going to let that dry real good. I want to let it dry real good because we want to be able to sand it. You don't want to jump into it right away, because if it's not dry real good, it'll start to ball up. So we're going to let that dry, and we'll come back to this part later on. Thanks for watching.